In this video, we will continue our lessons on how to set up the AirLogix centrifugal compressor controller. This installment is entitled, AirLogix Setup, Part 3. We will cover oil system configuration, motor start-stop configuration, cooling water, and condensate purge, and startup and load configuration. Now, let's explore the oil system configuration page. Some compressors have an electric main oil pump. If yours does, you would enable it here. Notice, an indication appears that shows whether your main oil pump is running, or not. Here is where you enable an air-driven, auxiliary oil pump. And again, you now have controls to start-stop that auxiliary oil pump. And third on the list, the more common configuration of a motor-driven, pre-lube pump. This value determines how long that pre-lube pump will run after the compressor has been started, before turning itself off. And the pre-lube recovery pressure field says at what low pressure will the pre-lube pump start again. The next 5 fields pertain to the oil heater. Whether the heater is enabled or not, the low and high limits for starting and stopping the heater, whether or not the oil pressure is a start permissive for the oil heater, and whether or not there is an oil level switch serving as a start permissive for the oil heater. Next, let's look at motor start configuration. By default, AirLogix uses one digital output that closes to energize the motor starter and start the compressor. When the compressor is stopped, that output opens. If your main motor starter requires a pulse to engage and release the starter, you would enable these 2 switches and set the duration of the pulse in their adjacent fields. Some compressors use a Y-delta motor starter. In this case, you would disable the momentary settings and turn on the Y-delta switch here. The timer determines how long we close the shorting contactor before moving to the delta contactor. This is the main motor coast down timer. It determines how long the motor has to coast to a complete stop before allowing this compressor to be started again. Here we see the total run hours for the compressor. You can enter a starting number when commissioning a new AirLogix system. These 2 fields determine how many times you can start the compressor within a given period of time. The start sequence switch gives you 3 more fields to allow you to create a custom start sequence for the compressor. The oil pressure timer ensures that after pressing the start compressor button, we reach an acceptable oil pressure within the timed value before starting the compressor. Otherwise, the compressor will fail to start. The same applies to the oil temperature, which in this case is set to 30 seconds. And the last field will determine how many minutes the oil pump will run after the compressor is stopped. Now let's look at the cooling water and condensate purge options. By wiring a cooling water valve to the appropriate input, you can enable the cooling water valve logic here. In this field, you can tell the controller the valve energizes to open or to close. And in the following field, how long the water should run after the compressor turns off. In the valve mode field, you can configure the cooling water for auto or manual operation. In manual mode, you will see a toggle button that allows you to open or close the valve. And just to the right, the current status of the valve is displayed. Much like the cooling water valve, you can configure AirLogix to automatically purge condensate traps at a preset time interval. Turn on the switch that says Condensate Purge. Decide if the output should open or close to activate the purge, and enter the time interval in minutes and the duration in seconds. Here is a switch that allows you to manually purge the condensate traps anytime you choose to do so. Now, let's look at some settings that pertain to startup and load configuration. The general start override timer will determine how long after a start that alarms or trips are overridden. This applies to all alarms and trips except motor or vibration variables. The motor current start override timer is specific to overriding a high motor current trip during the period of motor inrush. With regard to vibration start override, there are 2 variables. First, how long will the controller ignore the high vibration during criticals? And second, we have the option of putting a multiplier, or a limit, to the value of vibrations during that override time. After the start override timer has expired, all vibration alarms and trips will return to their preset values. If the vibration multiplier field is disabled, The controller will ignore all high vibration warning and trips for the duration of the vibration start override timer. Once the compressor has been started, this timer gives the machine time to come up to speed and stabilize before it is considered ready to load. On some compressors, starting with the inlet valve even slightly open can cause an inrush to the motor that overloads and trips the machine. For this reason, the closed inlet start timer determines the delay after starting before opening the inlet valve to its start position. This concludes part 3 of AirLogix setup. Be sure to come back for future videos. And once again, thanks for watching.